The seeds were worth more than the land itself. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew it. Jacob Mercer's hybrid corn seeds. 20 years of careful breeding, drought-resistant, legendary yield. Locked in a cedar chest since the day he died. They could have saved the widow's farm. Could have paid off every debt. Instead, Martha Mercer gave them to the man who had nothing left to lose. The rancher whose crop had failed. The stranger who arrived desperate on a September morning. But what she didn't know was that her act of mercy had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. The year was 1934, and the sun bore down relentlessly on Bitter Creek, a small farming town barely holding on to life. The dust storms, which had been a constant presence for years, seemed fiercer this season. The once green fields were nothing but a wasteland of cracked earth and withered plants. The scent of dust hung thick in the air, and a choking silence covered the land. Each morning, the wind would blow, lifting more dust into the sky, making it hard to tell where the earth ended and the heavens began. It was a world slowly suffocating. Martha Mercer had lived through many hard years, but nothing quite like this. She had been a widow for 8 months, ever since Jacob had passed away from a fever that left no time for goodbyes. Her grief was still raw, though she rarely let it show. She spent her days working the farm, tending to what little she could salvage from the land. But the soil was tired, the well had run dry, and there was no money to be had. The creditors had been kind at first, but even kindness had its limits. They were sending letters now, demanding $2,000 within the next month. If she didn't pay, they'd take the farm. And with that, her last piece of Jacob's legacy. Martha had been alone for the better part of a year, but there was one thing that had kept her going: the cedar chest in the corner of her bedroom. It was the one thing Jacob had left her that couldn't be sold or traded. Inside that chest were the seeds. Jacob's prized hybrid corn seeds, the very ones he'd spent 20 years perfecting. They had been his dream, a hope that they would one day feed the land when everything else failed. The only problem was that no one knew about them. Not until now. She had refused to sell them when a merchant, Silas Webb, came knocking a few weeks ago, offering $5,000 in cash for all of Jacob's seeds. The offer seemed like a lifeline. With that money, Martha could pay off her debts, keep the farm, and even buy new seed for the next planting season. But selling them felt like a betrayal. These seeds weren't just corn. They were the fruit of Jacob's years of hard work, his blood, sweat, and hope. Martha could still hear Jacob's voice on his deathbed, telling her, "Promise me you'll find someone worthy, someone who'll use them right, not just sell them for profit." The memory of those words pulled at her heart every time she thought about the seeds. The temptation was always there, though. Every time she went into the bedroom, the chest seemed to call to her. Every time the mailman arrived with another bill, the thought of selling the seeds came back to haunt her. The debt was growing. It wasn't just the $2,000. There were other small bills, repairs, and the mounting cost of keeping the farm running. The land was shrinking beneath her feet. Jacob's dream, their dream, was slipping away. But the decision had been made for her. She had no choice but to act. Martha stood in her kitchen one September morning, staring at the empty table. It was as if the room had closed in around her. Her hand shook as she reached for the key in her pocket, her fingers running over the cool metal before turning in the lock. The chest creaked open, and the scent of cedar filled the room, familiar and comforting. There, nestled inside, were the seeds, just as Jacob had left them. Before she could lift them, the sound of hooves on the dirt road broke the silence. It was a sound she hadn't heard in days, a horse coming down the road. She stepped to the window, squinting against the bright sun, and saw him. A man on horseback, his clothes dusty, his face gaunt. He was alone, and there was something in the way he moved, in the way he held himself, that told Martha he was a man with nothing left to lose. She could see it in the way his shoulders sagged and the hollow look in his eyes. He rode up to the porch, dismounted, and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion, "I'm Thomas Grant. I heard about Jacob Mercer's seeds. I've come to ask if you might consider selling them to me." Martha didn't respond right away. Her eyes studied him. There was a desperation in his gaze that reminded her of her own reflection in the mirror each morning. She could see the weight of his troubles in the way he stood, hunched and broken. And yet, there was something else, dignity, perhaps, or pride. He wasn't asking for charity. He was asking for a chance. Thomas continued, his voice almost pleading now. "I've tried everything. My crops failed 40 miles north. I've borrowed all I can, traded what little I have left, and now I'm out of options. My daughter, she's 7, staying with neighbors. I came here to buy seeds on credit. If you consider it, I'll pay you back, every penny." Martha's heart twisted. She thought of her own barren fields and the debts piling up. Her hand hovered over the chest again. The seeds were worth more than Thomas could ever pay. But the man had no options, and his daughter's life, his future, hung on her decision. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the words that came out would change everything. "Wait," she said softly before stepping inside, the chest still in view from the doorway. The sound of hooves faded into the dust, but Martha's choice was already made. Martha's heart felt like a heavy stone as she sat across from Thomas Grant on the porch, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The midday sun beat down, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. And for a moment, everything seemed to blur into the distance, just like the days that had passed since Jacob's death. Thomas, sitting on the edge of the porch, looked worn down by hardship, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a life he never asked for. His story, now fully laid out before her, seemed to echo the desperation in her own heart. He spoke of his wife, who had died in childbirth 2 years ago, and his young daughter, Sarah, who had become the only reason he fought to stay alive. The harsh winds of the Dust Bowl had driven him from one farm to another, but his crops had failed every season. Borrowed money was now a dead weight on his shoulders, and every day, without a solution, felt like the slow erosion of everything he held dear. "I've tried everything, Mrs. Mercer," Thomas said, his voice ragged but firm. "I've borrowed from neighbors, traded what little I had, begged for help. But no one will give me a chance. I heard about Jacob's seeds, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, they could save me. I came here to ask if you might consider selling them to me on credit. I'll pay you back as soon as I can." His words hung in the air, raw with desperation. Martha's gaze shifted to the cedar chest just inside the door, the one that held Jacob's seeds, and she felt her heart twist. The offer had come with the weight of 1,000 consequences. She had seen what the world was capable of, what it would demand when survival was on the line. But she had also seen Jacob's face in her mind's eye, his last words ringing in her ears. "Promise me you'll find someone worthy, someone who'll use them right, not just sell them for profit." Her hands trembled as she clasped them together, her mind whirling. Selling the seeds to Thomas would be an act of mercy, yes, but it would also be a leap of faith. It would be the ultimate test of what she believed Jacob stood for. To sell them to Silas Webb, as he had suggested so many times, would be practical. It would save her farm, it would pay off the debts that were choking her, but it would betray everything Jacob had worked for. Webb's offer of $5,000 for the seeds would secure Martha's future. It would settle every bill and buy her time to figure out a new plan, but it would also be a betrayal of Jacob's memory. She could almost hear his voice telling her that the seeds weren't just meant to survive. They were meant to bring hope to those who had nothing left to give. Jacob had always been one to give others a chance, to see potential in places where others saw only failure. Her father had taught her that too, the value of a helping hand, of trusting people when they were at their most desperate. But now, she was the one in need. Thomas was the one in front of her, his eyes pleading, asking for a chance to prove that he could make something of himself with the right tools. His eyes reminded her of Jacob's own when they had first met, hungry for something to believe in. She remembered how her father had given Jacob a place to stay when he had nothing, trusting in the strength of his character in the quiet determination that ran deeper than any man's fortune. Thomas had that same look in his eyes now, the same desperate hope that Jacob had once carried. But this time, the offer wasn't hers to make alone. She was alone now, with nothing but the memory of Jacob's promise to guide her. She could sell the seeds to Thomas on credit and risk everything if he failed, or she could trust him, just as her father had trusted Jacob, and hope he would repay her in kind. "I know you're struggling," Martha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been struggling too. You're asking for something that I can't give lightly." She paused, looking out over the empty fields that had once been a testament to Jacob's hard work. "I've lost everything, Thomas. Everything. And selling these seeds, giving them away like this, I don't know what that will cost me." Thomas's face softened, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I understand, Mrs. Mercer. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance." His voice was low, and there was something in it that made Martha's heart ache. She knew he wasn't just asking for seeds. He was asking for his future, for a shot at redemption, the same kind of chance Jacob had asked for all those years ago. And she knew, deep down, that the seeds were meant to do more than just feed a family. They were meant to restore a sense of purpose, to reignite a hope that had long been extinguished. She could feel Jacob's presence in the room, as if he were standing beside her, reminding her of what had always been important to him. "I don't know if this is the right decision," Martha said, her voice breaking slightly as she turned to face Thomas. "But I do know one thing. I promised Jacob I would find someone worthy to use the seeds, someone who would treat them as he did. And you're the closest thing to that I've seen in a long time." Thomas looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "But I promise you, I won't let you down." Martha nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her bones. She stood up, walked inside, and returned to the cedar chest. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the lid, then opened it slowly. The seeds lay inside, golden and perfect, just as Jacob had left them. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering Jacob's words, and then she carefully took a portion of the seeds, wrapping them in a cloth. When she returned to Thomas, she handed them to him, her hands trembling. "These aren't for sale," she said quietly. "This is a gift, a chance. Plant them right. Honor what Jacob built. And don't forget, Thomas, this is about more than survival. It's about trust." Thomas's eyes welled with tears as he took the seeds from her. "I won't forget, Mrs. Mercer. I swear it." As he turned to leave, Martha watched him walk away, the seeds in his hands, the future uncertain but filled with possibility. The decision had been made. Mercy had a cost, but it also had the power to create something new, something worth fighting for. The morning after Thomas returned with the first signs of hope, the town of Bitter Creek began to murmur. Word of Martha Mercer's decision to give away Jacob's seeds spread quickly, and with it came a wave of judgment, concern, and in some cases, admiration. By mid-morning, Silas Webb appeared at her doorstep once again, this time with a far colder demeanor. He had heard about the young shoots in Thomas's fields, and he was furious. "So, you've gone and done it now, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his tone sharp and filled with disgust. "You've given away your future, and for what? A few crops that might not even survive the drought. You'll regret this. I'll see to it that you do." He wasn't just angry. He was determined to make Martha pay for the way she had refused his offer. As he walked away, Martha felt a knot form in her stomach. Silas Webb's wrath was something that no one in Bitter Creek could ignore, and it wasn't just him she had to worry about. By the time church services rolled around on Sunday, the whispers were already thick in the air. Mrs. Hadley, the town's self-appointed gossip, leaned over to her neighbor, shaking her head. Poor Martha. Grief's clouded her judgment. She's given away everything that could have saved her farm. No sense in it. Not in this world. Other voices joined in, some murmuring in agreement, others quietly sympathizing. That's the Mercer spirit, Mr. Cooper, the local storekeeper, said with a sigh. Always about the sentimental. But sentiment doesn't feed your children. Martha could feel the weight of their words like 1,000 heavy stones pressing against her chest. She had done what she thought was right, but in the eyes of the town, she was just a foolish woman who couldn't see past her own grief. The look she received as she walked into church felt like daggers, and the once familiar faces now seemed distant, as if they were looking at her from a different world entirely. She knew the town was divided. Some admired her act of mercy, while others, particularly the more practical-minded, saw it as reckless. It was a strange sort of isolation to be surrounded by people who didn't understand her. Even the offers that came after, from men who had once never looked twice at her, only made things worse. One by one, they approached her, offering their assistance, their company, their support, though each had strings attached. Mr. Jensen, the elderly farmer who lived 2 miles out, was one of the few who had not passed judgment. He had been one of the first to offer help when Jacob was alive, and now, seeing Martha struggling, he was the only one who offered something that wasn't tainted with ulterior motives. One evening, after he had come by to offer a basket of vegetables from his garden, he gave her a long look. "Jacob helped me once, Martha," he said quietly. "And now, I'm helping you. If there's anything else you need, you don't hesitate to ask. The land may be dry, but people still need each other. You'll see." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to her. It was the first time in weeks that Martha felt like someone in this town still saw her as more than a widow or a fool. Still, the pressure from the rest of the community continued to mount. Martha's creditors weren't letting her off the hook either. A cold, professional letter arrived from the bank, signed by Mr. Thornton, demanding the full $2,000 in just 3 weeks. The words seemed to blur together as she read them over and over. She had no way of coming up with that kind of money. The small savings she'd managed to scrape together had evaporated with every repair and every bill she had to pay. As much as she had hoped that the seeds would bring her a miracle, she knew the reality was much harder to face. The bank would come for their money, whether or not she had the seeds or not. And as much as she hated to admit it, Silas Webb was right. Her farm was as good as gone if she couldn't pay. She spent the next few days selling anything she could: chickens, small tools, her mother's quilt. Each item sold felt like a piece of her soul being chipped away. But she had no choice. Every sale was a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. She was doing everything she could, but it felt like it was never enough. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming pressure, Martha couldn't bring herself to regret giving away the seeds. There was something in the way Thomas had returned, his quiet determination, the way his fields were already showing signs of life, that kept her grounded. She would have to keep working, keep selling what she could, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone in this battle. 2 weeks after the seeds had been given away, Martha received a letter from Thomas. She read it late one evening after a long day of chores, her hands tired and her body aching. The letter was brief, but the words filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in ages. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm writing to let you know that the seeds have taken. I planted them in good soil, and after just 8 days, the shoots are coming up strong. The soil isn't much to look at, but the seeds are growing, and I believe they'll thrive. Thank you doesn't come close to covering it, but it's all I have to give. I'll write again soon. Your servant, Thomas Grant." Martha read the letter twice, her eyes brimming with tears. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain her for a little longer. The seeds were doing their job. They were growing, and so was her hope. The community didn't know it yet, but things were beginning to shift. Martha sat in the quiet of her home that night, the fire crackling in the hearth, and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the mercy she had shown was not as foolish as the world around her seemed to think. And as she pinned the letter above the fireplace, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in months. Faith. Faith that things could change. Faith that the land would heal. And most importantly, faith that even in the darkest times, there was still room for kindness and trust. The storm that had been brewing in her life might not be over. But for the first time in a long while, Martha had a reason to believe that the worst was behind her. By the first Monday of October, Martha had already begun to prepare for what felt like the inevitable, the auction of her farm. She woke that morning knowing this might be the last time she would step out onto her porch as its owner, knowing that by the end of the day, everything she had fought for would be gone. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the one Jacob had always liked, though it seemed out of place in the barren landscape surrounding her. The sun beat down relentlessly, the dust still swirling in the air, but she forced herself to stand tall as she walked toward the barn. She packed a small bag with the only things that mattered: Jacob's journal, a photograph of him, and her mother's quilt, the one thing she couldn't bear to part with. Martha knew the town would come to watch the auction, some out of curiosity, others out of a sense of obligation. Silas Webb would be there, of course, eager to pick up the pieces of what was left of the farm at a fraction of its true worth. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, but as she stood in the yard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. By mid-morning, the dust cloud on the horizon caught her eye. She squinted into the distance, unsure at first what it was, but then the unmistakable sight of wagons appeared. Not just one wagon, but 7, slowly making their way toward her farm. At the front of the convoy was Thomas Grant, his figure familiar but more determined than she had ever seen it. Behind him, the other farmers of the area were following, all of them carrying goods, sacks of grain, and even a few livestock. As they neared, Martha stepped off the porch, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening, but something told her this wasn't an ordinary visit. Thomas dismounted first, and before Martha could say a word, he walked up to her, his face serious but filled with a quiet, unspoken hope. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "word's gotten out about your generosity and about the seeds. We heard about what you did, and we're here to show you that there's still hope for us all." He motioned behind him to the other men, who were unloading their wagons and setting up what looked like a small community gathering. "These are the men who've all had their crops fail. We've all been struggling, just like you. But when we heard that the seeds were growing in your fields, well, we thought we'd come together and give you a chance to save your farm." Each of the men introduced themselves briefly, speaking of how they had heard about Thomas's success, and how they too had tried to grow their own crops with little to no results. Some had lost their land, others were on the verge of it. But they all shared one thing: a deep respect for Jacob Mercer and the work he had done with his hybrid seeds. "You gave away something that could have saved you," John Willis said, "and we want to give back. You've given us hope, Mrs. Mercer. We want to make sure you don't lose everything now." The men, despite their own struggles, had come together to pool their resources for Martha's farm. The grain sacks, 2 milk cows, even 3 horses, everything they could spare was here as symbol of their gratitude. The total amount they had gathered was exactly $2,000, the amount she owed the bank. Martha stood there, speechless. She had expected her life to be reduced to the cold reality of loss, but instead, the farmers, strangers, really had come to her aid. It wasn't just charity, it was a statement of community, a statement that they were willing to stand with her, to stand for something bigger than themselves. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "This is too much," she finally said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I can't accept this. You all have your own struggles. You don't need to do this for me." But Thomas stepped forward, his eyes firm. "We're doing this because you did what none of us could do. You took a chance. You believed in something when it seemed foolish. And that's what we're going to keep doing. Together. You can't repay us, Mrs. Mercer, but we can give you what you need to save your farm. And that's what we're doing." Martha could see the sincerity in their eyes, And she knew then that this was more than just a financial transaction. This was an act of faith. These men were putting their trust in her, just as she had put her trust in Thomas, just as she had trusted Jacob's seeds to do the impossible. "You're right," she said, swallowing back the lump in her throat. "You've given me more than I could ever repay, and I will do everything I can to make sure this farm thrives again for all of us." The group moved forward, and before long, the auction was canceled. Martha watched as Silas Webb stood by, fuming, unable to do anything as the men worked together to secure her future. Webb tried to protest, tried to offer a lower price for the land, but it was no use. The community had spoken, and they were standing behind Martha. The bank, seeing the sudden change in circumstances, had no choice but to agree to the new arrangement. With the debts covered, Martha's farm was saved, and the land that had once seemed barren and hopeless was now filled with the promise of growth. As the last of the men finished unloading their wagons, Thomas approached Martha once more. "We've done what we can," he said. "Now, it's up to you to make these seeds grow. But I know you will. I know Jacob will be proud of you." Martha looked out over the fields, where the early signs of Thomas's crops were beginning to show, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a deep sense of peace. She had made the right choice. Jacob's legacy was alive, not just in the seeds, but in the hands of those who had chosen to work together to save what mattered. The dust seemed to settle in the air around her, and in that moment, Martha knew that mercy, though costly, had created something even more valuable, a community bound together by hope, faith, and the belief that no one was truly alone in the struggle to survive. The harvest would be more than just crops. It would be the fruits of a shared belief in the strength of mercy and the power of giving. As the days grew shorter and the crisp autumn air began to settle over Bitter Creek, Martha could feel the weight of what had happened pressing in on her. Her farm was saved, at least for now, but it felt like a fragile victory. The community that had rallied behind her was still there, but so was the threat of everything falling apart. Silas Webb's angry glare lingered in her mind, his words of reproach echoing in the back of her thoughts. He wouldn't forget what had happened, not by a long shot, and neither would the bank. The temporary relief she had felt when the auction was canceled quickly faded as the reality of the situation settled in. Thomas's crops were growing strong, and the others were beginning to see the benefits of the hybrid seeds Jacob had perfected. But Martha knew the battle was far from over. The bank would still come for its money, sooner or later. The threats from Webb and his allies would continue. And while the community had come together for now, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing just beneath the surface. The days passed with a sense of quiet tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The crops were growing, yes, but so was the storm on the horizon. The promise of new life was tempered by the constant threat of destruction. As the end of the month approached, Martha knew the bank would return, demanding its payment. She had no idea how she would come up with the money, but she couldn't afford to lose hope now. She had made it this far. She had stood up to Webb, and she had trusted in the seeds that Jacob had left behind. She couldn't stop now. But as the weather turned colder, so did the atmosphere in town. People who had once supported her began to pull back, unsure of where to stand. Some of the farmers were nervous about the growing success of the crops, wondering if they could really trust the seeds to hold up. The drought was still a constant threat, and though the seeds were thriving in Thomas's fields, there was no guarantee that the harvest would be as strong across the board. Martha had tried to reach out to others, to encourage them to believe in the seeds, but doubt had crept in. She had no choice but to keep going. She worked dawn to dusk, her hands raw from the constant work of keeping the farm running. Every day felt like a battle, and every night she lay awake wondering what the next day would bring. She couldn't give up. She wouldn't. But she also knew that Silas Webb was watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. He had his eyes on the land, and if the harvest didn't pan out the way everyone hoped, he would be there, ready to swoop in and buy up the farm for a fraction of its true worth. Webb's grip on Bitter Creek was still strong, and even though he had been temporarily thwarted, Martha knew he wasn't done. He had power, and he had money. That made him a dangerous enemy. She had no illusions about that. Then, one evening, just as the sun was setting, disaster struck. Thomas's barn, the one where he had been storing half of his harvest, caught fire. It spread quickly, devouring the structure in minutes. And before long, the fire had consumed nearly everything inside. It wasn't until the next morning that Martha learned the truth. No one had seen anyone nearby, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been no accident. The fire had been too sudden, too violent. She had seen Webb's wagon leaving town the night before, just before the fire broke out. It was only a whisper, a gut feeling, but it made her blood run cold. The timing was too perfect. Webb had threatened her before, and now it seemed like he was making good on those threats. Thomas stood in the ashes of his barn, his shoulders slumped, his face streaked with soot and despair. Martha could see the heartbreak in his eyes as he surveyed the damage. He had already lost so much, and now this. Sarah stood nearby, her small hands covered her face, her body trembling. Martha felt her heart ache for them. They had already been through so much, and now this. It was as if the world was conspiring to tear them apart, to take away everything they had fought for. She wanted to go to Thomas, to offer him words of comfort, but the truth was she didn't know what to say. The fire had stolen so much from them already, and now they were left with nothing but the ashes of their hopes. As the fire smoldered, Martha's mind raced. The fire was no accident. She had no proof, but she knew what had happened. Webb had made his move, and the worst part was that Thomas hadn't even had the chance to see the full potential of the seeds he had planted. The fire had destroyed half of his harvest, and with it, any hope of paying off the debts that still loomed over them all. Martha stood there, watching the smoke curl into the sky, and she felt a deep sense of anger rising within her. She had fought for this farm, for her future, for the memory of Jacob. She had given away everything she had to give, and now it seemed like the world was taking it all back. But she wasn't going to let it happen. She couldn't. The fire was a blow, but it wasn't the end. Not yet. There had to be a way to fight back. She wouldn't let Webb win. She wouldn't let him destroy everything they had worked for. Martha stood tall, the dust swirling around her like a storm. She wasn't going to let this defeat her. Not now. Not when she had come so far. As the sun set behind her, casting a golden glow over the ruined barn, Martha made a silent vow. She would fight for this farm, for Jacob's legacy, and for the future that was still possible. The storm might have come, but she was ready to face it, whatever it took. As December approached, the weight of the impending trial hung over Martha like a dark cloud. Every day was a step closer to the showdown that would determine her future. The fire that had ravaged Thomas's barn had only added fuel to the firestorm of challenges they were facing. Martha couldn't ignore the facts. Webb had the money, the power, and the influence to make the legal battle a nightmare. She had no choice but to prepare for what was coming, and that meant relying on every ounce of strength she had left. The town's support had been invaluable, but it wasn't enough. The community had rallied around her, bringing her food, supplies, and moral support, but Martha knew the fight wouldn't be won on good intentions alone. Mr. Daniels, the local lawyer, had agreed to take on the case, but even he was cautious. "It's going to be tough, Martha," he'd told her the night before the trial. "Webb's got deep pockets, and he'll stop at nothing to win. But we have the truth on our side. We just have to prove it." Martha hadn't known what to say. The truth seemed so simple to her. Jacob had bred those seeds, and they were his legacy, something he had poured his heart and soul into. But proving that in court, especially against Webb's army of expensive lawyers, would be another matter entirely. The trial was set for December 15th, and as the day drew closer, Martha could feel the weight of the town's eyes on her. People whispered in hushed voices when she passed by, and many of the farmers who had initially supported her began to retreat, unsure of what the outcome would mean for them. Martha couldn't blame them. The stakes were high, and if Webb won, the entire town could be left at his mercy. It was a small town, and one man with enough power could change everything. The night before the trial, Thomas came to see her, his face tired but resolute. "We've done all we can, Martha," he said quietly. "Now we just have to stand by the truth." She nodded, grateful for his steady presence. It had been a long road to this point, but through it all, Thomas had been her anchor. They had become more than just neighbors. They had become allies in a fight that neither of them had chosen, but one that they were determined to win together. The next morning, the courthouse was filled with people, a mix of the town's residents and those from neighboring areas who had come to see the outcome of the battle between Martha Mercer and Silas Webb. The judge, an older man with a stern face, called the court to order, and Martha's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, only that this would be the hardest day of her life. Webb's lawyers wasted no time presenting their case. They argued that Jacob Mercer had stolen the seed genetics from Webb's family, that the seeds were the property of Webb's grandfather, and that Jacob had taken them without permission. They painted Jacob as a thief and Martha as someone who had inherited stolen property, someone too emotional and sentimental to see the truth. Webb himself sat in the back of the courtroom, a smug smile on his face as his lawyers spoke. Every word that came from their mouths was designed to discredit her and destroy the memory of Jacob's work. It was a brutal attack, and Martha felt every word as if it were a blow to her chest. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. When it was Martha's turn to testify, she stood before the court, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She held out the leather-bound journals Jacob had kept for years, the records of his work with the seeds. "These are Jacob's journals," she began, her voice clear. "They document every step he took in developing the hybrid corn. They show the methods he used, the careful breeding, the cross-pollination he perfected over the years. Jacob was meticulous in his work. Every seed he planted, every variation, every result. He recorded it all. These journals are the proof that the seeds are his." She placed the journals on the table in front of her, and the court fell silent. She could see the skepticism in the eyes of Webb's lawyers, but she didn't waver. Jacob didn't steal anything. He created these seeds. He spent 20 years of his life working to perfect them, and when he died, he left them to me because he believed they could help others. I didn't give them away because I was sentimental. I gave them away because I believed in what Jacob created. I gave them to Thomas Grant because I knew he would use them the way Jacob intended. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Martha felt the weight of the moment, the pressure of the world on her shoulders. She had laid it all on the line: her husband's legacy, her own future, the future of the community, and now it was out of her hands. Webb's lawyer tried to discredit the journals, but Martha stood firm, pointing to the detailed records that proved Jacob's work. When the judge allowed expert testimony from Professor William Hartford, an agricultural expert who had known Jacob for years, the tide began to turn. Hartford testified that Jacob's work was groundbreaking, that his breeding methods were unlike anything he had seen before. "These seeds are unique," Hartford said. Jacob Mercer was an innovative farmer, and his contributions to agriculture were his own. "These seeds are the result of years of careful work, not theft." It was the turning point. Webb's case began to unravel, and with it, his claim to the seeds. The judge listened carefully, weighing the evidence, and when the time came for Thomas to testify, his words sealed the deal. "Mrs. Mercer gave me the seeds when I had nothing left," he said. "She trusted me with them, and I planted them in good soil. The shoots are strong. They're growing. They're Jacob's legacy, and I'll do everything I can to honor that." The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when he finally spoke, his words were clear. "This court finds in favor of Mrs. Mercer," he declared. "The seeds belong to her. Mr. Webb's claims are without merit." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Martha felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She had won. The seeds were hers. Jacob's legacy was secure, and the community could breathe again. Webb stormed out of the courthouse, humiliated, but Martha didn't care. The battle had been won, and she had fought for what was right. She looked to Thomas, who stood beside her, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that the future was possible. She had kept her promise to Jacob, and together, they had made sure his legacy would live on. The victory in court had been sweet, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter, one that was just as uncertain and fraught with challenges as the last. The town of Bitter Creek slowly began to heal from the tumultuous weeks leading up to the trial, and Martha felt the change in the air as the season shifted. The snow had fallen early that year, covering the land in a blanket of white, and though the town was still recovering from the hardships of the Dust Bowl years, there was a sense of cautious optimism that hadn't been there before. Martha's farm, once on the brink of collapse, was now alive with promise. Thomas's crops, bolstered by Jacob's hybrid seeds, had flourished despite the drought. The once barren fields were now dotted with strong, green shoots, and the harvest, though still a long way off, seemed as though it would be bountiful. Yet, even with the growing success, there was a quiet tension that remained. The weight of the past few months still clung to Martha's shoulders. She had survived, yes, but what came next? It wasn't just about the harvest. It was about rebuilding her life. Every day she spent on the farm, working alongside Thomas, she felt herself moving closer to something she hadn't been able to admit for a long time: the desire for a new beginning. The days grew longer as spring approached, and with it, new challenges arose. The town began to take notice of Martha's success, and not just in whispers this time. People came from nearby farms to ask for seeds, to see the miracle for themselves. Martha had always known that Jacob's seeds were something special, but now they were proving to be more than just a way to save her farm. They were a symbol of what could be accomplished with hard work, trust, and community. The more people came to see, the more Martha realized the profound impact Jacob's legacy had. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about helping others thrive. One morning, as she and Thomas were working together in the fields, Sarah came running toward them, her face bright with excitement. "Mama," she called, her small arms stretched wide. For a moment, Martha froze, the word "mama" hanging in the air like a sweet, unexpected gift. It had been so long since anyone had called her that, and in that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. She smiled down at Sarah, who threw her arms around her legs in a tight hug. "What is it, sweetheart?" Martha asked, bending down to meet her. Sarah beamed up at her. "I was talking to Mr. Jensen, and he said that the seeds are the talk of the whole county. Everyone is asking about them. We're going to help all the farms, aren't we?" The excitement in Sarah's voice was contagious, and for the first time in months, Martha felt a deep, genuine sense of pride. The seeds were not only a means of survival, they were a way to bring hope back to the community, a way to make sure that no one had to face the future alone. The next few weeks were filled with visits from neighboring farmers, some of whom had struggled even more than Martha, their fields just as barren. But now, with the promise of Jacob's seeds, things were starting to change. Martha and Thomas worked side by side, distributing seeds to those who had none, teaching them how to plant and showing them how to nurture the land. Slowly but surely, Bitter Creek began to see a transformation. Fields that had once been desolate were now growing, showing signs of life. Crops that had once failed were beginning to sprout. And as the days passed, the community that had once been fractured by the harsh realities of the Dust Bowl began to come together again. Martha's life, once overshadowed by grief and uncertainty, was beginning to take on new meaning. She had helped Thomas rebuild his life, and now, together, they were helping others. She couldn't have imagined this when she had first given away the seeds. The sacrifices she had made, the risks she had taken, seemed to be paying off in ways she hadn't expected. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch after a long day's work, Thomas turned to Martha, his face soft but earnest. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion that Martha couldn't quite place. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let her unease show. "What's that?" she asked. Thomas took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees as he looked out at the fields. "You've given so much, Martha. You've given me hope when I had none. And I've watched you give so much to this town. I'm just wondering, when this is all over, when the farm is secure and the harvest is in, what will you do?" Martha looked at him, her heart racing. She hadn't allowed herself to think too much about the future beyond survival. But in that moment, she realized that she had the power to shape it. She thought of Jacob, of the promise she had made to him, and of the new family she had found in Thomas and Sarah. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. "I don't know what the future holds, Thomas," she said softly, "but I know I want to help others. I want to make sure this community doesn't forget the importance of what we've done here. I want to make sure that the seeds we planted, both in the ground and in each other, continue to grow." Thomas smiled, his eyes softening. "Then we'll do it together." For the first time in a long while, Martha felt a peace settle over her. They had come so far, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time, she could see a future where they would face the challenges together, side by side. The harvest was a symbol of what they had built, of the trust and the faith they had in each other. And as the sun set over the fields, casting a golden glow over the land, Martha knew that home was no longer just a place. It was a feeling, one that she had found in the hearts of those who had stood by her, and in the promise of the future she had yet to build.